to work in factory mills or just factories. And they were in between the ages of about 14 years. That was the lowest, which the oldest was probably like 17. And with this, it was the idea of like children working in the field, in factories, sort of sparked, controversies, especially during this time, which was sort of like a progressive era. And Congress saw that this was also a problem. And what they did was they enacted the Keaton-Owen Act in 1916 as a means to combat child labor. But as you will see later on, that attempt actually failed. The second time they did was the child labor tax, which as a means to control the idea of child labor, which also later on you will see that that also failed. And to this day, the idea of child labor exists, especially in low-income migrant families, and also new arrivals. Just a general overview. The policy for child labor is that there's really no provisions as to protect. There is one, but it doesn't address the agricultural aspect. It just generalizes conditions for general work, not specifically agricultural work. And according to New York, about 48 states actually come in contact with child labor. Okay, this is just the timeline of tracing the policy. In 1916, the Keaton-Owen Act was passed. Later on, in 1918, it was challenged and found unconstitutional. The next thing that Congress tried to do was the Revenue Act of 1919, or the child labor tax, as the means to prevent child labor. But then again, that also failed. It wasn't until 16 years later that there was some type of provision for kind of child labor, which was the 1930 Fair Labor Standards Act, which sort of regulated the wages and the hours that employers could actually work. And after that, there's really no further development within the policy. And these are just the type of produce that are picked by children, such as cherries, grapes, melons, or oranges. And these are found in states such as California, Georgia, Texas, or Florida. And the real problem with the child labor is that it's demoralizing. It's the exploitation of children. It's the use of cheap labor for the big companies to make millions of dollars, and while the children and the parents make almost to nothing every day. Now we get into some Supreme Court cases that are relevant to this topic. The first case, which was Hammer versus Dagenhart, was the case that declared that the Keaton-Owen Act was unconstitutional on the grounds that Congress cannot regulate the trading within the states. It could only regulate what goes in and out of states, not in the states. The next case was the Bailey versus Drexel case, which this one found that the child labor tax was unconstitutional, based on the Congress invading the state's 10th Amendment rights, which states that any powers not delegated in the Constitution are given to the states or the people. And child labor is such a thing that is not in the Constitution, and states have the right to control that. The last case was the United States versus Darby, which sort of challenged the Fair Labor Standards Act, but Congress found that it was okay. Congress was allowed to actually pass this. They were allowed to regulate the wages of workers and the hours that they could work for. And these are just some organizations that are fighting to sort of end or have some rights for children, such as the International Labor Organization, the Child Labor Coalition, or the National Child Labor Committees. And the proposal that will come later on is focused on the ideas of the International Labor Organization. So some loopholes in like so the current policy that I found was that under the uh, uh, under the FLSA, which is the Fair Labor Standards Act, children can actually work in the field because it is agricultural work is not listed as a thing that Congress controls. And also within the state governments, even if the states do have the power under the 10th Amendment to make child labor policies, they do not do so because they are more worried about other things rather than the immediate effect of child labor. So my proposal is that it's the abolition of the institution of child labor by state governments at the beginning, and then the next level would be a constitutional amendment. And with that, it's not just about ending the thing, and there needs to be a backup plan as to what happens now they don't have work. So the suggestion that I make is that there should be a universal education system for former laborers so they can lean on that. So some of the details are that it'll be like ending through the states because each state has the power to pass child labor laws. And with that, it will just show after each state has some type of child labor, anti-child labor law, then the U.S. government will eventually realize that these states actually want the whole idea of child labor to end, which will make them want to pass an amendment that will actually end the institution like they did with slavery with the 13th Amendment. And after that, after it's over, children will actually receive an education where they will actually be what they want to be when they grow up. They don't have to be tied down to the field anymore. They will actually work where they want with fair conditions and be treated as a person and as equals. And with that, though it will save a lot of lives, it will also bring in more taxpayers because these children are not technically taxpayers because they don't pay taxes. They're just paid with cash. And cash is not a thing that is recorded. The companies just pay, they give a person some cash and they give it to the children or to parents who work there. And it's not really recorded. So the next slides will deal with controversies. And the way I define controversy was that it is the constant debate about a specific topic through multiple lenses. And the first lens deals with the individual rights versus the common good. So the elimination of child labor is not really an individual rights or a common good. It's more, I see it as a humanitarian thing, as something that needs to be done. But it can also be looked upon as the individual rights of either the child or the company that has the right to hire whoever they want. And the common good aspect is just is the good thing to end it so that children wouldn't have to suffer. The second lens has to do with the government versus the state. In this case, the state of Oregon. So in this thing was who should be given the power to make such laws regarding child labor. And as I stated earlier, it should be resided within the states. And eventually the government will have control over that. So an example that I found of non-enforcement was when it says in the past 10 years, the Labor Board took 42 reports of farmers breaking child labor rules and issued 6 fines, totaling up to $12,850. And that's what the report. So that seems kind of absurd that they looked at 42 farms, but only issued 6 fines. So what happened to the rest of the 36 farms? Were they just let go, or they really don't say what happened to them? So with this, in general, the general thing for me is that it shouldn't be left up to the state of the government. it should be left up to someone who actually knows about this, who cares about it, and who will actually enforce it. But to be more realistic, it should be left to the states because they have the power to actually pass policies within the state because of the 10th Amendment. The third lens that I looked at was the public. What does the public think? And that's just an inquiry into public opinion conducted by interviewing a random sample of people. So the graph shows a total of 99% of people living with 1% as the majority in the world. It shows that 83% of people, and it seems like what they actually surveyed were parents. 83% of parents think that children should not be allowed to work in a field, while 13% of them will actually let them work in a field. And they suggested the reason as to sort of a discipline to show them like what it's like in the real world, to give them some type of view for the next stages in their life. While 3% will allow children under 14 to work more than 40 hours a day, but they did not specify a specific reason as to why. The fourth lens has to deal with the economic aspect. So what happens, where's the money, what's making more money, what is more logical, or which is going to give them money, the alternative or the current policy? So these two graphs show the current policy and the alternative policy, whereas the alternative policy yields $4 trillion over a 20-year period, and that's not just with ending it, and that's also with the education system put in place once it's over. Whereas the current policy only yields 20 million, which is a lot for the companies, and it's like less than what a child or even a group of children actually make. And they do contribute about, as you can see here, about $1 million or so, and that's just for tools, to planting the lines, and to every little things like shipping it and stuff like that. But and then they gain more than any of the people they hire.